Lakeland Currents is sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service. Nisswa Tax Service offers tax preparation for individuals and businesses across from City Hall in Nisswa and on the web at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to this special edition, this 1 hour long program of Lakeland Currents, where tonight we're going to look at the Sandpiper project going across Minnesota, which is is generating a lot of interest around the area. So we're very pleased to be able to take a little extra time to talk about this in depth, to give people a real good idea of the facts of the matter, of what's happening with the Sandpiper project that's going to go through the it's a pipeline for oil, for crude. And I'd like to first of all state, though, that our program is kind of co-sponsored today, as we have probably 3 or 4 times now. We've done some sponsorships with the Rosenmeyer Center through the Central Lakes College. And for people who are not familiar with Rosenmeyer, Senator Gordon Rosenmeyer was a very, very influential man, grew up in Royalton and became a resident of Little Falls. And the college, Central Lakes College, a number of years ago started something called the Rosenmeyer Center. And it has its own board. And the purpose of the center is to promote education about different topics, to inform people, to better educate people about what the issues of the day are. And so we're very happy to be working this program today with the Rosenmeyer Center. And my guest today will be later on at the college talking about some of the very same things at an open forum at Central Lakes College. So I'd like to welcome, and it's not going to be hard to remember their names because they're both Paul. I'd like to introduce Paul Eberth, who is the project director for the Sandpiper project, and Paul Stolen, who is I'm going to struggle a little bit with this, but we'll try to get through it, Paul, a retired DNR biologist who has worked on 12 different pipeline projects, and who also is a volunteer with Friends of the Headwater. Is that the correct pronunciation of that program?
Yes.
Introduction, I should say.
A volunteer for that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So welcome both to the program. Thank you for taking your time to come out and talk to our audience about this project that's going on.
Yeah, well, thanks.
Yeah, and you know, Paul Eberth, maybe we could start with you, and maybe you could just give us an overview of what the Sandpiper Pipeline project is.
Okay, well, maybe if it's okay with you, let me start out with just giving a brief overview of Enbridge.
Sure.
Because I think it'll tie into what the Sandpiper project is and why we proposed it. So Enbridge, just in general, is an energy company that operates entirely within North America, in the U.S. and Canada. And in fact, our business started about 65 years ago with a pipeline that was built right through northern Minnesota, so from Alberta to Superior, Wisconsin. So we've been operating here in northern Minnesota crude oil pipelines for about 65 years. Over that course of time, our business has grown to include additional pipelines through northern Minnesota and through this area. And that's what will bring us to the Sandpiper pipeline in a bit. And I'll talk about what's happening in the energy industry in crude oil transportation. But in addition to the crude oil transportation we have in this area, we have a couple other business units. We have a growing renewable energy business. Fortunately, my family got to spend a year out in Colorado with Enbridge, building a 250 megawatt, $500 million wind farm just a few years ago. We now have 4 wind farms in the U.S., a solar plant just south of Las Vegas, and interest in a geothermal facility near the West Coast as well. Another business unit is gas distribution. So if you're in the eastern part of the U.S. or Canada, primarily in Canada, we deliver gas to residents and businesses. And then we have a gas transportation business in the southern part of the U.S. So it's a little bit of background just in Enbridge in general. Folks have probably heard about us as a company in northern Minnesota more and more in the last few years because our business has been growing. And our business has been growing in this area, particularly due to the development of oil resources in the center of the U.S., both in Canada and in North Dakota. And what we've been seeing in the U.S. is generally a shifting of supply of crude oil resources. So at one point in time, the U.S. had more crude oil that came to the country from places offshore out of North America. And as we've developed resources, not Enbridge, but as others have developed oil resources such in Alberta or the Bakken area of North Dakota and Montana, those oil resources are directly displacing non-North American sources of crude oil. And the pipeline business, the business that we're in, is needed to transport that to the markets. So we've been growing our pipeline business in order to move the growing supplies to the refining centers throughout North America. In the particular case of North Dakota, people are likely familiar that there's been a boom in shale drilling and oil production in North Dakota. And today there's a lack of pipeline capacity to move that growing supply of crude oil out of western North Dakota and Montana. So the Sandpiper Pipeline Project is a project that we've proposed to increase the capacity of our existing pipelines by building a new one next to one of our existing ones to bring that crude oil out of western North Dakota to two terminals that we own and operate in the area, one in Clearbrook, Minnesota, and another one in Superior, Wisconsin. We've had a pipeline in operation that comes from western North Dakota to our Clearbrook terminal, and I think that was built in the mid-60s. It is operating today, and it's been mostly full for the past several years. So since 2006, we've been under a condition that we call apportionment, but it means that the pipeline's generally been full, and we have a lacking ability to add more capacity to that existing pipeline. So that's driven the need to look at building a new pipeline, mostly adjacent to that one, from western North Dakota to these two terminals that we operate in northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin.
And I know there will be a map on the screen showing people where the proposed line is. To make a clarification, is not connected to the Keystone Project, which so many people are in National Congress are talking about, because that actually is going from Canada through the United States down to the coast, if that ever goes through. But you're not connected with that project in any way or form.
No.
And your project does start from North Dakota and ends in Minnesota, or I should say in Superior, Wisconsin.
That's correct.
So it cuts through those three different states.
Yeah, that's right. The proposed route for the pipeline, I talked about a pipeline that we own and operate out of North Dakota today that comes into Clearbrook, Minnesota. So the proposed route for the new pipeline would be to follow that existing pipeline from western North Dakota to Clearbrook. And then at Clearbrook, Minnesota, there are several other pipelines that connect with us in Clearbrook that are owned by a different company called Minnesota Pipeline that heads straight south out of Clearbrook. Clearbrook is just northwest of Bemidji. So our proposed route for Sandpiper is to follow those existing pipelines just south out of Clearbrook to a point near Park Rapids, where those pipelines continue south.
So are they side by side, essentially?
They would be, generally. And then to follow a route that generally follows electric transmission lines from a point just south of Park Rapids to near Interstate 35, where we join up at a point where we have existing pipelines again, and then continue to our terminal in Superior, Wisconsin.
So Paul Stolen, could you just help us a little bit understand your background and your connection with the Headwaters group?
Yes. First of all, I became involved with this pipeline last April, or actually in March, and then worked on it independent, strictly for my own interests. And then I became connected with Friends of the Headwaters in September, and have been advising them. I want to get into a little bit about my background before we get into the details of the pipeline project, because it's relevant. My long-term interest in my various jobs have been in how scientific information is used in public policy, and I worked in the Minnesota legislature for a consulting firm for a little while, and then the state of Montana and Minnesota State Planning Agency, and then the Minnesota DNR. And in each case, that was my interest. I got involved into what's called environmental review, which is environmental impact statements and environmental assessments are done. And those are both federal and state laws that require looking at projects to see what kind of impacts they have, or they might have, before they're built, so that you can either change the project, modify it, change the location, or put mitigation measures on it to reduce impacts. And the United States, when you look at these laws, were actually created in the United States. They've been adopted by the rest of the world, and they're the reason why we have clean air and clean water. Fundamental reason, because we look at something, what are the consequences before they happen? We're very good at that. And these are not discretionary laws. These are mandatory laws, and they very much apply to this project. And I would just mention there's another project that Enbridge is, it's called the Line 3 Replacement Project, which is coming right behind Sandpiper, and they want to put it in the same location. And so the concept of doing environmental review, the bigger the project, and as measured by the cost of the project, potential consequences, the area of land affected, triggers a deeper review, more in-depth review. It requires more independent review, and it requires the application of science, and that's built into the laws. And so my career I've spent working on large projects, some of them very large, designing scopes of work to determine what kind of impacts. I've managed environmental impact statements. I've been a pipeline inspector in the state of Montana. So I approached this project from that point of view, and also I guess I would say I was paid by the citizens for my career, and I had a good career, very interesting career, and liked it. And I'm volunteering without pay because I want to give back.
Could you just tell us a little bit too about the Friends of the Headwater for people who
they're a
familiar
group
with that organization?
And that reminds me, I'm not opposed to this pipeline. I'm opposed to this location of the pipeline, and ever since last April. And Friends of the Headwaters is also not against this pipeline. They believe it should be put in a different location that has less risk to the environment.
Who are the Friends of the Headwaters?
They're a group that Richard Smith is the president. They're a group of volunteers, and they began their work last winter, actually, about the time I was involved in it, and they've gotten become more and more involved as time went on. And then the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, they were retained as their law firm for Friends of the Headwaters, and a lawsuit was filed in the fall by Friends of the Headwaters and the center, saying that an environmental impact statement must be done for this project. So we can get into a little later there's a very complex review and difficult review going on of the project. It needs a permit. It needs a certificate of need from the state and a route permit. We can get into more of that a little bit later, I think.
So, Paul Eberth, where are you folks at in terms of the progress of the pipeline itself?
Okay, well, the project was conceived probably in early 2012, and we started developing at that time. In 2013, we submitted an application to both the Minnesota Public Utility Commission and the North Dakota Public Service Commission. Since that time, we've received our permits from North Dakota, and we're still working through the process in Minnesota. Mr. Stolen's right, we need a route permit and a certificate of need in the state of Minnesota. At the Minnesota PUC, that application was deemed to be complete in early 2014. So we're about a year into the process.
So this all has to be approved eventually by the Public Utility Commission. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Minnesota PUC?
And other agencies. The Army Corps of Engineers will be involved in issuing permits. Department of Natural Resources would be Minnesota Pollution Control Agency.
So I believe you've had a number of public hearings now on the topic. Are you done with that stage of the process?
For the certificate of need portion of the process, we've completed the public hearings and the evidentiary hearings. It's likely that there will be another set of public hearings and evidentiary hearings for the route permit process. Maybe this fall, if we're successful with the certificate of need.
You would have everything done by fall, maybe?
No, I'm sorry. If we're successful in securing a certificate of need, then we would have another round of public hearings for the route permit. And those hearings would probably be this fall.
So are you finding that when you have your hearings, people are there a lot of people opposed to it? Are a lot of people for it? If they're opposed, what are the issues? Could you help us understand
Sure.
that?
Well, we had a significant turnout for the 5 public hearings. And in fact, we do have a record of who showed up. The judge kept a tally and actually asked supporters to sign up on one sheet and opponents to sign up on another sheet, so he could have an even spread back and forth, so no one side could rule the floor when asking questions and providing testimony. So we actually saw supporters show up in a number greater than 2 to 1 of opponents. So we really saw a lot of support turnout for the hearings. Support came in the way of the agricultural community. And their particular interest is that to see the oil be moved by pipeline rather than rail, because the rail congestion has really hurt their ability to move grain to market. We saw supporters come out from emergency responders that testified to the fact that it's safer to have the crude oil moving through the pipe than it is by rail. In fact, we had Anoka County talk about the rail challenges they're experiencing and how it inhibits emergency responders to get to the scene of accidents due to trains blocking traffic.
Well, there's a huge accident last week out east, obviously. That was, I believe, with the latest technology in tank cars.
Correct.
The double-walled tank cars, and they still created quite a bit of havoc. I can't remember what city that was in, but it was in New Jersey, I think.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of union support turn out as well. These projects bring a significant amount of jobs during construction and jobs during operation. So we saw a lot of union support out there as well. And we saw support from local communities. I think 5 counties along our proposed route in Minnesota have actually passed resolutions in favor of the project. And they're seeing benefits in the way of increased tax revenue. So Sandpiper, if it goes in service, would pay approximately $24 million in property taxes, primarily to the counties, to the county tax coffers.
So how does that work if I have 5 acres of land and you go through that? How does that affect my tax?
Yeah, it doesn't affect an individual property owner's taxes.
But
that's
the
right.
person would probably get something from you for allowing you to go through that property, I would guess.
Correct, yeah. The landowner would get a payment for an easement, and then the property taxes are assessed by the state and then paid back to the counties by the state.
Okay. And how big of a pipe are we talking about here?
We've proposed 2 different sizes, so a 24-inch pipe coming from North Dakota into Clearbrook, and then a 30-inch pipeline going from Clearbrook to Superior.
And what are the risks of those pipes rupturing? I mean, I probably live within a mile as a crow flies from one of the Koch brothers pipelines, and I know that there's a substation there where there must be guys there 3-4 days a week testing those pipelines. And there are accidents, obviously. There have been. And south of Staples, we had one a few years ago. But I would guess the technology is getting more sophisticated all the time with that.
It is. The technology is improving. The industry's safety performance is improving. Our safety performance has been improving. We haven't been a perfect operator, but we've always been there and taken responsibility if there ever is, a release. Our first line of defense is to prevent a release. And we do that through many different methods. We have a control center. In fact, if you walk into it, it looks a little bit like an air traffic control center. It's in a secure location. There's operators on the controls 24/7. They can shut down the pipeline with just a couple clicks of the button. We have remote operated valves along the pipeline, remote operated pump stations. And then, like your experience with the Minnesota pipeline operators, we have folks that are staged along the system and working at different locations in order to ensure it's operating correctly.
Would this pipeline be able to transport other materials if you wanted to? Fertilizers or things like that, or is it strictly oil?
It is strictly oil, that's right.
So, Paul, I would guess that one of the concerns that the Headwater folks have is the closeness to water tables and to bodies of water.
Right. There's Friends of the Headwaters developed some slides. As a individual person, I'm not especially good at computer graphics, and so I'm using their slides. And the Sandpiper route goes through some very major lake country. We'll have a slide of that. It goes through major wild rice areas. It goes through a complex landscape of lots of groundwater emergence. It's a glacial moraine, very hilly landscape. I have a there's a slide showing the area around north of Itasca Park, where I'm very deeply familiar with that because I worked on the MnCan project that went through that area when I was employed by the DNR. There's a valley that project goes through called LaSalle Creek. That the ridges on both sides are 100 feet higher than the creek. It's a trout stream, and right downstream is a very valuable lake. When MnCan went through there, they did a hydraulic drill. They did it in the winter. It was a 24-inch line. It's 3,000 feet long. The drill was, and there's so much groundwater emerging here that it doesn't even freeze in the winter. The landscape doesn't freeze. And they had what's called a frack out drilling mud reaching the surface, even though the pipeline was about 25 feet below the creek. Drilling mud came out, a whole lot of drilling mud came out, halfway filled up the creek. Project was stopped. I was involved in the attempt to clean it up. Drilling mud sometimes has toxic materials in it. It's mostly bentonite clay, which is not toxic, but it can cover aquatic habitats. Enbridge is evidently proposing to trench that, perhaps because of what happened with the MnCan project. But I'm familiar with trenching on other projects in that kind of an area, and there's about 40 feet of organic muck under the creek because of that deep glacial valley. And if you tried to when you trench it, you get collapse of the sidewalls, and so you put in sheet pile. Well, I don't think you can actually put sheet pile in that area because of the geology. Enbridge may think they can, but I've seen projects where there's a huge mess when they try to do that, and cascading impacts. So that route is they're following an old pipeline corridor that was created years before there was any environmental laws. It's a bad corridor, and that was found very much demonstrated on the MnCan project. And try to avoid LaSalle Creek, you're running into all sorts of other complex landscape, east or west. Very difficult area. It's a perfect example of why that's a bad route to follow. Now, talking about pipeline risk, I've tried to convey this pipeline and Line 3, since they want it to go on the same spot, and you have to. The laws require you to look at both projects at least to some extent.
Is that Line 3 also supposed to bring
25 feet away
oil?
From? Yeah, it's actually, some of it's going to be tar sand oil, according to the Enbridge website, and it's proposed to be located 25 feet away from Sandpiper, and that's going to be a 36-inch line. So if you look at the amount of oil going through those areas, I've tried to, it's listed in million or in 100,000 barrels per day, that sort of thing. I've tried to translate that into figures that somebody can understand. And if you take a Ford pickup, a new Ford pickup, F-150 Ford pickup with a 26-gallon tank, which is the smaller of them, those two pipelines will pump the equivalent of 2.4 million Ford pickup tanks per day in those two pipelines. And if you want to translate that further, if you assume that those new aluminum frame Ford pickups get 25 miles to the gallon and they have a 200,000 mile life on them, you'll wear out 300 pickups per day with that equivalent material going through there. That's per day. So if you have a pipeline rupture in those areas, and of course the risk is low, very low in fact, that's a point totally conceded, but this is a 40 or 50 year project life, and there was, I want to read a statement that was made by an Enbridge vice president in July 2010, at Representative James Oberstar's hearing in Congress. He said, when asked about pipeline integrity, he said, "Our response time from our control center can be almost instantaneous, and our large leaks are typically detected by our control center personnel." 10 days later, Enbridge pipeline ruptured in Michigan. It wasn't shut down for 17 hours, and 20,000 barrels of oil spilled into the Kalamazoo River and polluted 35 miles of the river. The cost of cleanup so far has been $1.2 billion. And of course, Enbridge has changed their management system, but there was complacency had developed in that control center. It was human. The NTSB did a big investigation. It was very much human error. Suppose 20 years of no problems on this pipeline, and the complacency develops 20 years from now. I mean, that's a whole generation of people. And will that always be the case? And in 1991, there was an Enbridge pipeline rupture by Grand Rapids. And that was an on-land rupture. 40,000 barrels of oil, according to the Coast Guard incident report, came out of that pipeline and was on land, and it flowed into a tributary of the Mississippi River near Grand Rapids. And luckily it was in the winter, and it flowed on top of the ice, and they were able to put booms on it. And so the cleanup of that, it didn't reach the Mississippi, or if any reached the Mississippi, it was very little. And so that's been almost forgotten about. If that had been the same situation, a summer rupture reached the Mississippi, we wouldn't even be talking about the Michigan spill here. We'd be talking about the Mississippi spill, and we probably would have better pipeline laws in this state. And we might not even be here today. Because I think a pipeline, given that, if that had happened in Minnesota, I think one of these other much safer pipeline routes would have been proposed by Enbridge.
So you said that your organization, well, not your organization because you're just a volunteer, but the Headwaters organization is not opposed to the pipeline.
No.
But is opposed to the direction that it's going. What would the alternative from that organization's perspective be about where to go with it?
Well, it's probably a time to kind of break down a little bit about the process. The hearing process and the permitting process, the public can propose alternative routes, and that happened last spring. There was a number of alternative routes came in, and in fact, I have a slide of the it's Enbridge slide showing their pipeline system, and this sandpiper oil is going to Chicago, largely going to the Chicago area, and so the question is, why does it have to go through Superior? And there's a number of other routes that have been proposed going directly to Superior, and for example, there's one in much more safer country where the pipeline can follow another existing pipeline, go to Chicago. Now, that at the time, the Public Utilities Commission and the Department of Commerce, they both have responsibilities. It's a complex system, and I don't think we need to go into that right now, but normally on pipelines, and I worked on Alberta Clipper and Southern Lights when Enbridge built those in 2000, permitted and built in 2008, 2010. They went through the same process, and the certificate of need and routing permit were handled simultaneously. In this case, and there was a lot of internal controversy in the agencies, but there wasn't much public attention to those projects at the time, and and a lot of dissatisfaction actually within the state agencies on those projects. And now there's been much more public attention to Sandpiper, and has changed things greatly. And these other routes were proposed, and the Public Utilities Commission decided to split the certificate of need and the routing permit process, and they suspended the route permit and are processing the certificate of need. And there's an administrative rule hearing with a law judge going through essentially supposed to be a factual fact-gathering stage, and then he makes a recommendation. And the hearing was closed several weeks ago. It's a legal. There's a judge. You swear. You're sworn in to testify, that sort of thing. And then he makes a recommendation to the Public Utilities Commission. And there's legal briefs submitted. The deadline for the first round of briefs was last Friday. Enbridge submitted them. Each party, and there's a formal party because it's a formal administrative rule process. And the other Friends of the Headwaters submitted a brief, and there's a Carleton County Land Steward Project or organization. They submitted a brief wanting the other routes looked at. And then there's another round of one more round of essentially rebuttal briefs, and then the ALJ, the law judge will make a recommendation. I think it's in May.
Approximately in May or June.
Right, and then that goes to the Public Utilities Commission, and then there's opportunity for the parties to submit information directly to the PUC after that, disagreement with or agreement with the law judge findings, and then they make a decision, and that's the certificate of need. And again, I would mention that these other routes, I believe Friends of the Headwaters, well, I would point, if I wasn't involved with Friends of the Headwaters, I would be still involved in this project.
Just as a citizen.
Right.
Paul, you work with 3 states. This is, how did you get into this line of work? To the average viewer, I'm sure this sounds so complex. You have 2 or 3 different processes to go through. Are there similarities between North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin in going through this process, or are they all very different? One state more challenging than the other, or how does that play out?
Well, they are quite different. In the case of North Dakota, it didn't take as long, for example, and it was a bit more of a straightforward process. In the case of Minnesota, the Minnesota Public Utility Commission, due to some of the reasons that Paul Stolen brought up earlier, made a decision to slow down the process here in Minnesota to take a look at some other routes. In the case of Wisconsin, unless you need condemnation authority, you don't need a permit from the Wisconsin Public Service Commission.
Really?
So they are very different.
Of course, Minnesota's got the most land in the stake of this one because of the distance. Well, maybe not. North Dakota's.
It's probably equivalent in
close,
North Dakota. That's right.
Yeah. This is also very political, obviously, because of the politics involved, people lobbying for and against. And the thing I've always found is sort of difficult is to get past the strong feelings people have about their general ideology and look at the facts.
That's right.
It's a little hard to get to the facts to get through all those other things. But has your company thought of alternative routes too in this process?
Yeah, we have. So just to back up, there's 2 fundamental permits we're looking at in the state of Minnesota from the Minnesota Public Utility Commission. This first one, the certificate of need, is going to look at broad alternatives to the project. That includes the route that Friends of the Headwaters proposed, which goes through southern Minnesota, and some others. The second part of the process, this route permit process, and don't get confused by the name because some routes are being looked at in the certificate of need process. But during the route permit process, they'll look at route deviations as well. And since we've applied, we've been talking with landowners and communities along the route. We've actually proposed to the state, 23 changes to what we originally proposed as our route in order to accommodate, concerns that the DNR might have around a particular crossing, or a landowner might have about his property because, future, development plans. So there's, we're open to many different changes within, the certain scale of what we propose, as long as it still goes to Clearbrook and Superior, and generally, follows, the path that we've proposed. We're open to make changes. What we're not open to is just building a pipeline to Chicago instead of Superior. It's just a fundamentally different project if you were to do that. And just to describe why, we have a significant terminal in Superior, Wisconsin, which has additional pipelines that go to many different places throughout North America from there. By building it to Superior, we're able to connect to that pipeline hub where the volumes can then continue on to the markets where they're needed.
So they end up in a refinery in Chicago? Or is that
well, that's one location. I mean, Ohio, Michigan,
they're all
Kentucky. Yeah,
they're going to.
That's right, all in those different areas.
And I would guess that your company's done a lot of research on the safety of pipelines versus rail. Have you done comparisons there? And if you have, what generally have you found out?
Yeah, you know, it's a tough topic because lots of people define safety different ways. You know, Mr. Stolen and Friends of the Headwaters are very much concerned about safety for the environment. Others are very much concerned about public safety. So there's lots of different ways to look at the numbers, but generally we see, incidents by pipeline cause less damage to people and property than incidents by rail transportation. And for those, keeping abreast on the news, you've likely seen some very fiery train derailments in the last couple of years.
When you talk about the safety of the lakes, Paul used that incident where it went 17 hours before somebody actually got control. I would guess that you've made major changes in how you operate pipelines since that era.
Absolutely.
How quickly can you shut off something if something leaks now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can shut it off within a couple minutes. The reason it wasn't shut off at that time is, the operator, just to be honest, the operator saw an anomaly in the operations, but didn't interpret it as a leak. And unfortunately, it happened during a period of shutting down the pipeline, and it was just left to say it didn't pump for 17 hours. It was mostly shut down during that time period. But unfortunately, like I said, the controller misinterpreted the information coming back. So we've added significantly in the way of redundant leak detection systems in order to make sure we get better alarming, at the control center. We've invested significantly in training of operators. And we've invested in an entirely new control center. So there's been significant changes, since
so can you actually monitor the length of your pipeline for pressure changes?
That's right, yeah, for pressure changes. We have a computational model to measure volume in and volume out at different places as well to do a mass balance calculation, and others, flow meters.
Could you help us understand a little bit about the pipeline, and this will be helpful for the viewers when they see this on the map, but it goes across, as I look at this, it's going to cut across the northern part of Cass and Crow Wing County. Is that the correct direction that you would be going? And you say about 75% would be following an existing route. Is this part of the new route then that would be dropping down and through here where there is no existing pipeline?
Well, there are existing pipelines on that portion of our proposed route from Clearbrook down to Park Rapids.
Right. But how about across northern Cass and Crow Wing?
So from Park Rapids, when we head east, the proposed route is generally alongside of electric high voltage transmission lines. Not the entire way, but for the majority of that stretch it is.
So that's an area that you wouldn't have to cut trees down or anything like that. You could go in beside those existing structures?
No, it would require its own footprint, and it would be adjacent to the transmission line. So it would require clearing a new right-of-way. Immediately adjacent to the transmission lines.
And do you actually come close to lakes? I mean, obviously the aquifer is an issue all across this whole area, but do you actually come close to lakes?
Actually, when you look at the details of the map, we worked hard to avoid areas of high lake concentration. So, for example, today we're sitting in the Brainerd Lakes area. We're north of that, that high concentration of lakes. We're east of that significant concentration of lakes, which runs from the Detroit Lakes area down to Alexandria.
So, Paul, Stolen, help us understand a little bit now. When the research is done, when the certificate of need and that sort of research is done, and it comes to the PUC, who are these people and how are they making these decisions? Could you help us understand that a little bit?
They're appointed people. I'm not actually real acquainted with exactly how they're appointed. They're not technical people.
Appointed by the governor?
I believe they're appointed by the governor. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, I believe they are, and I believe also they're supposed to be a political mix, and so they actually have a political role, you might say, because they're supposed to be from both parties. Now, that raises a very interesting thing, because one thing that's greatly at issue here is the quality of information. And again, I would repeat that a huge project like this, both, and again I have to repeat, both projects together will potentially affect, I've just a very rough calculation, during construction 10,000 acres, both projects. And they're over $2 billion. Environmental impact statements are normally done, it isn't even debated that a project this size normally has an environmental impact statement done. And that would be very scientifically based information that would be done by an independent party. Most of the information that has been submitted on the record now is from Enbridge, and the only other scientific information that's been submitted is from the Pollution Control Agency, the DNR, and then the consultants like myself. And otherwise, the depth of information is very shallow. But based on what we have at the moment, it very much goes against putting the pipeline in this route. And of course, Enbridge wants to put it where they want to put it. That's entirely their business. But the state of Minnesota has the public interest of seeing whether that's the appropriate place. Enbridge has written their contracts to fit going to Superior. It's a private interest. It's private contracts. And so essentially you might say that Enbridge is saying we want to put it where we want to put it, and the state of Minnesota doesn't have any opportunity to say anything about it. I believe the law goes against that. Minnesota has an opportunity to say where it should be located, and that location is not on this route. Now, talking about oil risk, it's not quite as simple. There's studies of other large pipelines. You have pinhole leaks, for example. There was a very high quality study done for the Keystone Pipeline Company and the U.S. State Department on Keystone that found that a pipeline of this size, you can have pinhole leaks that leak 28 barrels of oil per day and can go undetected for several months. And you can't detect, the way you detect pinhole leaks is to look for oil on the surface. And it eventually does reach the surface. But here you have pipelines that maybe, if they're drilled, they may be 30 feet under the river. Or they, in very hilly terrain, they're not, the depth of burial is deeper, that sort of thing. So the whole, and again, I would emphasize, this is a 40 or 50 year project life that you're dealing with. You can't just look at the moment, integrity management of the moment, but aging pipelines, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, but the basic issue right now, the most eminent issue is the quality of information. The quality of information that's been submitted is coming from people who believe, and experts who believe that, and these are good experts. I would mention that my first pipeline experience was working on the bending crew when Lakehead Pipeline built Line 3 in 1963. I was a union laborer on the bending crew when I was 19 years old, and that's when I first learned about pipelines. And pipeliners, I've had a lot of respect for pipeliners. They put in a high-tech system. They're very qualified people, the people that install pipelines. They're very good at land restoration and justified to be proud of their work. I and the people who have reviewed this pipeline, who have problems with it, am also proud of the quality of our scientific work. And we believe very strongly that this is a bad idea to put it on this route, not in the public interest of Minnesota. And we are not against the pipeline. This is not an issue of rail traffic. It's not an issue of jobs, and it's not an issue of taxes. Because if you put the pipeline in a different place, all three of those things will be accomplished. So there's jobs, taxes, and rail traffic.
So Paul, in your research and you're working across these three states, are you running into resistance from groups in North Dakota or Wisconsin?
There has been, yeah, there are some concerns generally. You asked earlier about what the opposition said at the public hearings, and And really, I think they were generally in two camps. Folks that didn't want the pipeline through their area, in particular Friends of the Headwaters as a group out of the Park Rapids area. And they've told me one-on-one, we're for the pipeline, we just don't want it in Hubbard County. And they don't want it in particular in their area. We've heard others come talk about climate change and those issues. So those are the two primary things we've heard. There's always challenges on the routing side, no doubt about it. In fact, one of the commissioners last year, I think, said it very well. They were talking about whether or not they add these additional alternatives that went through southern Minnesota into the mix to be studied. And one of the commissioners who was speaking against bringing those in, or speaking just about her concerns about bringing those in, she said, look, I have experience with citing major energy projects, and no disrespect to anyone's particular interests in the crowd. When you pick up an energy project and just put it in someone else's backyard or in a different part of the state, we will see different resources of concern. So, no matter where we put it, there'll be some of those routing challenges. In fact, there has been reviewed now by the department for all the different system alternatives that were proposed across Minnesota. In fact, they hired an expert third party, so HDR, an environmental consulting firm in the Twin Cities, did a study, not for us, but hired by the Department of Commerce, and they produced a report of environmental effects for all the different system alternatives. And in fact, David Schaefer wrote a very good article in December summarizing the results of that report, and he said Enbridge's route fared much better than the alternatives in many important ways. It crossed the least number of streams, it encroached upon the least number of population centers, and it put at risk the least amount of drinking water resources. So there are areas of specific resources where our route has fared much better. In fact, if you were to route a pipeline down to Chicago, for example, instead of Superior, you're talking about building a pipeline that's several hundred miles longer. And length does correlate with impact, or with resources at risk. In fact, the Mississippi River crossing for the Friends of the Headwaters proposed route was reported by the Department of Commerce to be 6,900 feet wide. So that's a big river crossing, much different than crossing the Mississippi up here in northern Minnesota.
Wow. Yeah. What do the producers in the oil fields look at long term? If they didn't have an opportunity to pump this, what does that mean? Maybe either one of you can answer that, maybe you can't answer that, but they must be looking, and I know right now we're in a recession and they've cut back on production of the oil, but if the oil were to get back up to where they would like it to be, it seems to me there's been a lot of controversy about not having enough trains available to even get that crude out of there because it's competing in the fall with agricultural crops. What do you have discussions with those companies?
We do have discussions with the shippers, and generally the shippers are looking at the most economic, efficient, and safest method to transport their commodity to market. And as an energy company, generally we take a low capital risk with our projects. So just to share an example, I talked about the Cedar Point wind farm earlier. Most people don't build wind farms unless there's a long-term power purchase agreement in place. So for example, that wind farm I worked on, we had a 20-year power purchase agreement with Xcel Energy to buy 100% of its output at a set rate. And that provided the commercial backing in order to finance the project and ultimately build it. In the case of Sandpiper, we did something similar. We went out to shippers and we said, we'll build a new pipeline, we'll expand the capacity on our system if you're willing to make a long-term commitment to use it. And during that process, we received long-term commitments from shippers to use the pipeline. And that, in fact, provides the commercial backing and the guarantee that it will be used if it goes in service. So, for example, Marathon Petroleum is what we would call our anchor shipper. They made a substantial commitment to use the pipeline for a long period of time. And they put their balance sheet, in place at providing to demonstrate that they had the financial resources and capacity to meet that long-term commitment. They own and operate the largest amount of refining capacity in the Midwest. So they're a substantial customer that has come to the table and made a commitment to use the pipeline. They also asked for some ownership interest. So following the completion of the project, they would also be a 30% owner in our North Dakota pipeline system.
I'm not an expert in any of this, so we only have about 6 minutes left. So
Okay.
is there any key issues here that I'm not asking that you would like to talk about? I do have other questions, but I mean, is there any key thing here that we haven't touched on that you think our viewers need to know?
I think there's just some important benefits to the state that I just want to highlight again. Our business, our company, moves a commodity that's of significant value to us. It powers our school buses, our tractors, our vehicles. The company believes that over the long term, we may need to be less dependent on carbon sources, and that's why we're building our renewable energy business as aggressively as we can. But today, we see a change in energy landscape. We're seeing less crude oil coming into our country from non-North American sources, and more crude oil being developed mid-continent, so out of the North Dakota, out of Canada. And we need the infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, in order to adequately and safely get it to market.
Paul, is there anything there I'm failing to ask you here?
I guess I would just add some emphasis on a couple of things that have already been brought up partially. Paul mentioned the study by the Department of Commerce of the different routes. And Enbridge also did a study of the different routes. Both of those studies were actually not analysis. They were data. They didn't even begin to suffice as far as an impact assessment. Even though they're called an impact assessment, Enbridge also submitted a groundwater study and a lake study, and those, especially the lake study, was called an assessment of impacts, but it was in fact not. It was merely data. And so this is the kind of shallow, it doesn't meet the requirements of the law. And it's extremely significant that you have the agencies who have looked at it, the parties that have looked at it with some impact assessment, have found this route to be wanting and to be difficult. And again, Enbridge's private interest is to move it to Superior. The public interest should be first to look at this more in depth. But if you're going to go by the information available right now, the scientific information, it very much goes against where the route is going to be proposed. And normally on a project like this, you do risk assessment. In fact, Enbridge must, by federal law, do a risk assessment of the largest amount of oil that might rupture, or from a rupture. That information is not available to the public. They've done it, it's not available. The contracts that they've submitted to go to Superior are not available to the public to be examined. So there's extremely crucial information lacking.
Paul Eberth, if everything went the way you would like to see it go, the way your company would like to see it go, when would you see this construction beginning?
Yeah, if things were to move forward on schedule now, we would see construction taking place in 2016 and the project going into service in 2017. So just to provide some context, I talked about the development starting in 2012, and now we're talking about the project going into service in 2017. So, we feel that substantial review is taking place. It takes place over the course of about 5 years, and that the state's doing a good job.
How many people would be employed in the process of developing this pipeline?
Well, today, directly, there's about 30 folks on the team working on the project. But indirectly, there's many different companies and businesses that we're supporting. At the peak of construction, the workforce would be in the thousands.
That's a big project.
It is a big project.
That's a big project.
Sandpiper is about a $2.6 billion investment here in North Dakota and northern Minnesota.
And you said when you hit Superior, then can you go off in different directions, and you can go to Chicago, and you can also direct it to the east?
Yeah, that's right. We have a variety, or several pipelines that leave Superior, and some of those go through the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and head east. some head south into Chicago and other places in Illinois. From there we have, again, more pipelines that continue on to Cushing, Oklahoma and south, and pipelines that continue east again into Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio.
If people want to find out more about your project, how can they get in touch with what you're doing?
Yeah, great. At Enbridge.com, you can start there. There's also a projects website that you can get to through Enbridge.com.
Paul, if people want to find out more about the Friends of the Headwaters, I'm sorry, what should they do?
They have a website. I've learned in my whole career that the public is a lot smarter than sometimes they're treated. And this business of at the hearings putting up a yes or no, against, for or against, I think was actually insulting to the public. I would encourage interested public to read the briefs that have been filed. There was a couple of pretty good briefs filed by the against this route by the Friends of the Headwaters last Friday, and then by Carleton County Land Stewards on Friday. Those are available. I'll urge Friends of the Headwaters to put the links up, but they're understandable. I mean, you have to be interested to go through them, but they explain a lot about the project.
Okay, thank you. Thank both of you for taking the time out to come over here and talk to us. I think it's helped our viewers understand the issues better. And we're not pretending to have the answer for our viewers, but appreciate both of you taking the time to present that information. I'd like to thank the Rosenmeyer Center also. As I said, their mission is to inform and educate. And that's what our mission is at Lakeland Public Television, is to inform and educate also. So if you'd like to know more about this, check out those websites. Follow your local newspapers, because this is an issue that I'm sure you'll be hearing about all summer long. You've been watching Lakeland Currents, where we're talking about what you're talking about. I'm Ray Gildow. So long until next time.